So I live in Vancouver, and one day I got on a plane and I flew to Toronto. And I was sitting with all these pastors at this conference, and I'm sitting across the coffee table from this one guy. I'd never really met him before. I kind of knew of him, and we were chatting, and he said to me a kind of a strange question. He said, how's your house? And I'm like, what do you mean? Why is this guy asking me about my house? And he's like, well, I just get the sense that something's going on in your house. And if you want to know what it is, I can tell you. And I'm like, well, how would he know that over the last few months, I've been like waking up in the middle of the night, experiencing this kind of presence almost in my home. And I'm walking around my house at 2 o'clock in the morning, thinking someone's there night after night after night. And I was actually terrified. And then I fly to Toronto, and this guy says, yeah, and he looks at me and he's like, if you want to know, I got to tell you something. And I don't mean to seem weird. He's like, the demons, they're in your closet. What? What do you mean? He took a napkin and he drew my whole house. And he said, is this where your office is? Is this where your bedroom is? Is this where your kitchen is? And then he drew this little circle. He said, they're in there. They're demons, and they've been invited by the last people who lived there. What? Now, listen, I share that story not as a proof of the existence of God necessarily. I'm sure a skeptic would find ways to explain all of that away. I tell you it just as one of the many unusual, even supernatural experiences that I've had. So what do we do with that and the millions of other stories like it, held by rational, credible people, stories that defy all logic? This guy had never been to my house. He didn't even know what was going on. If only one of those stories turns out to be true, then listen, our modern naturalistic, materialistic assumptions about the world all fall apart. See, this is why I believe it takes more faith to be skeptical about miracles than it does to actually believe in them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, how did a rational skeptic like me, especially regarding miracles and the supernatural, because that's not how I grew up, ever come to actually see them as something that made sense? Let's start it this way. There are many reasons people reject Jesus, and so they reject Christianity, but one of the primary reasons is the distrust of miracles. The Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. displays a leather-bound version of the Bible assembled by President Thomas Jefferson, where the pages of the Gospels are cut out that have miracles in them. Why? Because Jefferson excluded every miraculous event from the Bible. He started out with a premise that said they don't happen. And that represents the kind of Jesus the modern world kind of wants. But it was always something people wanted in Jesus' own day too. See, rationalists at the time of Jesus pondered his teachings and scrutinized his miracles. They denied plain evidence, and they sought alternative explanations for them, such as the devil's doing them, or he has magical powers, or whatever. Today, the thinking goes something like this. We in the modern world know miracles don't happen, right? They can't happen. Therefore, Jesus couldn't have done them. And the claims that he did are simply false. So this skepticism is extended to the Bible as a whole, filled with miracles from beginning to end. Basically, people look at it, ancient, naive, uninformed people. It's not for modern scientific people. And so the march of science has continued to trample belief in the supernatural. There's this German physicist, Max Planck, who predicted in 1937 that faith in miracles has to yield ground. He said, step by step, the steady and firm advance of the forces of science will plunder the idea of miracles. Its defeat is indubitably a mere matter of time. So is all of this true? Well, no. What I want to say is that the reality is miracles are actually probable given the kind of universe in which we find ourselves. So is the naturalist, atheistic view of reality correct? Are miracles ruled out as impossible? Well, before we even get started, we got to understand something. A naturalist, let's define that, is a person who believes his view on nature and reality and miracles are simply the product of looking at the evidence, looking at the natural world and just drawing conclusions based purely on science, but experiment and observation. And the first thing we must do is point out, this simply isn't true. See, if you're a naturalist and you're watching this, your understanding of what is allowed to happen or not happen in the universe is actually first a philosophical approach, whether you know that or not. So you approach data and predetermine that your experience of nature will actually dictate what you believe about it, that it has certain laws that can't be broken, for instance, which is actually kind of dangerous because scientists tell us today that we got to approach the data not with a predetermined idea, but with a blank slate of actually investigating what's happening, and understanding of what is possible actually begins to evolve. Here's what I mean. In his book, Miracles, there was this Oxford professor, C.S. Lewis. He was a longtime skeptic, and this is what he wrote. He said, if anything extraordinary seems to have happened, we can always say that we or they who experienced it have been victims of illusion. If we hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural, this is what we shall always say. In other words, what he's saying is what we learn from experience depends on the philosophy we bring to it. If, for instance, we start out with the assumption that miracles are impossible, then no amount of historical evidence about the life of Jesus or anyone else is going to convince us. So that won't do. We can't start there. But that isn't fair to the process of historical inquiry, because the matter has already been decided before the adventure has begun, in a sense. You've already decided these things don't happen. So if miracles are possible, though immensely improbable, then the right evidence could potentially convince us that miracles have actually occurred. So again, all we must conclude at the outset is that miracles are not intrinsically improbable or impossible, and we must be open to the possibility of them actually occurring. That's it. And this is why the philosophical question is the one that comes first. Are miracles actually even possible? If they're not, then end of discussion and we're done with it. But if they are, at least hypothetically possible, then we got to look at the evidence and decide, rather than just dismissing the idea outright. And I'm going to contend that once we're in a position to do that, we're going to see, as one writer has said, that the existing evidence will be sufficient to convince us that actually quite a number of miracles have actually occurred. So let's talk about the contradictions of the naturalistic approach to the world. Where do we get this idea that miracles aren't possible? As I mentioned, it's actually rooted in the philosophical assumption that the belief that there's only nature, there's only a material world that we can test and see and feel and touch and smell. There's no transcendent. There's no spiritual or immaterial world. Nature, as one writer has said, is the whole show. Nothing exists or happens outside of natural realities, or what we have called the laws of nature. One of the most famous philosophers actually talked about this hundreds of years ago was a guy named David Hume. And he presented all kinds of arguments. And what he said was that the laws of nature are established by a firm and unalterable experience based on the consistent testimony of countless people in different places and times. So if one defines natural laws as immutable, he said, like unable to be changed, then of course miracles are impossible. But here's the question. Who can conclusively say that natural laws are unchangeable? There are a number of laws of nature that have been overthrown by more recent scientific discoveries, right? Alvin Plantinga talks about the ideas. He says this, he says, consider the dismaying realization. Newton's laws were for nearly 2 centuries regarded as absolutely true. They worked incredibly well. Indeed, no body of general statements had ever been subjected to so much empirical verification. Every machine incorporated its principles. The entire Industrial Revolution was based on Newtonian physics and mechanics. Newton was vindicated 1,000,000 times a day, Plantinga says. Yet, Einstein's theories of relativity, which came later, contradicted Newton. Newton's laws were proven in important ways to be wrong, or at least inadequate. In other words, scientific laws, here's the first thing we've got to grasp, are not actually immutable. Like they're not necessarily laws of nature. They're human laws. They're interpretations that represent our best guess about the world and the way it works. So Hume insists that miracles violate the known laws of nature, but in the end, listen, there are no known laws of nature. That's what science, it keeps coming up with things. So so-called laws are being refuted, rethought, rewritten. So consider the question of the origin of the universe. For hundreds of years, there was all kinds of different theories about how it actually happened. You had the steady state theory, and then Big Bang cosmology came along and said, no, this is actually how the universe began. See, science is always being edited and changing and evolving in its very conclusions. And so the need for humility in regard to the conclusions is overwhelming for all of us, even from the scientific perspective. See, Hume's whole approach to this topic is set up in a way that he would never end up with an actual result which he didn't already agree with. He sets it up. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Well, It's a bit of a category mistake to frame the question of miracles that way. This is why Lewis in his book says this: when a thing professes from the outset to be a unique invasion of nature by something from the outside, increasing knowledge of nature can never make it either more or less credible. That's the point. His point is that when someone believes in miracles, they aren't arguing that nature, left alone, is going to produce the event they're talking about. They assume that there's another agent acting in that event that transcends nature, that transcends the whole natural order in some way. So they're tampering with things. In other words, miracles aren't contradictions of science. They lie outside of the realm of science. And the thing is, this actually doesn't even make miracles odd. There's other things that can't be tested and proven in a scientific way, like ethics and morality and beauty. See, rarely does this lead for someone to conclude that ethics doesn't exist or morality doesn't exist. Science can't actually put everything in our existence through the scientific method and prove it. See, the philosophy of naturalism bases its predictions on the premise that things like miracles just don't happen if there are no interferences, though. And that's the point. People who believe in miracles believe the same thing. By definition, miracles interrupt the usual course of nature. And they must have help to do so. That's the point. Catching an apple as it falls from a tree. That's the image. The law of gravity isn't any less real or effective just because a hand got in the way. See, something, in this case, my hand, if I grab an apple, has broken the natural process of falling. That's not a contradiction, it's an interruption. And so that all takes us a step closer to the view of biblical miracles, but it's kind of incomplete because the Bible does not see a miracle as something done by kind of an alien outsider. It's the act of an author injecting a new element into the story, but one that kind of rings true to the way things work already, just on a different scale. So Lewis says it this way. He says, God creates the vine and teaches it to draw up water by its roots, and with the aid of the sun to turn that water into a juice which will ferment and take on certain qualities. Thus, every year from Noah's time to ours, God turns water into wine. And in this way, the argument for miracles is an argument for kind of an X factor that goes over and above nature. This is why they are supernatural. The view that God is someone interfering in the natural world comes from more of a deistic view of God, like the Bette Midler theology, right? Where God's out there and he kind of spins the world around. It's like, from a distance, you know I'm around. Like that kind of view of God, that's deism. That's not actually the biblical view. The biblical view is that God is intimately involved. He's the sovereign and sustainer of all things from beginning to end. Yet he's unique from it. Right? He's something outside of nature. This is exactly what Christianity claims. Not that nature by itself would give us miracles. That's not what happens. When Jesus comes back from the dead, what's the biblical claim? It's not that nature spit Jesus back out from the grave. What does Paul say? Ephesians chapter 1. God raised Jesus from the dead. Right? Acts chapter 2, God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death. Over and over and over again, that's what the Bible claims. The statement says nothing that contradicts the laws of nature. Saying that God raised Jesus from the dead has zero implausibility with respect to our knowledge of natural processes. Listen. Here's what one writer has pointed out. William Lane Craig said this: only if the atheist has independent reasons to think that God's existence is implausible or his intervention in the world implausible could he justifiably regard the resurrection hypothesis as implausible. It's the same thing with all miracles. Christianity doesn't argue this is going to happen according to nature. It says God supernaturally did a thing beyond what nature by itself can do. And so the mistake skeptics make with miracles is first assuming that nature is this closed system that defines the entirety of reality. Talk about the motives of believing that. See, all this is why Cambridge professor John Polkinghorne, this is what he says: the fundamental problem is not about miracles, but about transcendence. That's the question we have to ask. So let's ask this question. Is there a conflict in some way between the naturalistic scientific thing? It may surprise actually some readers that to learn that naturalism as a philosophy is now seen by many people as actually outdated. It's a product of the 18th century. The mechanistic portrait of nature given by the science of that day kind of took widespread influence on the world and the scientific community for 200 years, but many of the conclusions are now viewed as totally outdated. So the perspective of this is actually referred to as classic or old science, and the old picture of science versus the new picture of science. Because as philosophers and scientists have gotten more into the universe, the new picture that's arising is that science does not actually conflict with miracles at all. As the fields of biology and cosmology go deeper and deeper into science, what they've realized in the universe is there's more complexity than we ever thought. And so the more legitimate miracles have become. One writer says this: miracles actually have complete consistency with modern science. To give an example, the older modernistic way of thinking held that no event could be uncaused in any way. But if you go look up the entire field of quantum theory today, it's founded on the very notion of uncaused events. Quantum theory is counterintuitive to a mind trained in older classical Enlightenment scientific paradigms, to the point where it seems actually wrong. But that isn't a license to throw away all quantum mechanics and all quantum science. So ironically, Hume himself recognized the limitations of science. He was arguing that miracles, while they defy science, he admitted that those scientific laws are technically unverifiable. He said, since no finite number of observations, however large, can be used to derive a general conclusion that is defensible. So if one asserts, for instance, that all swans are white, how would this assertion be verified? By observing 10,000 swans? A million? See, all it would take is one black swan to make that hypothesis false. And that's actually what happened when Europeans landed in Australia. And to that point, Western civilization had believed all swans were white. It was an irrefutable scientific fact until our awareness of our limited perspective changed and a black swan was found. So the idea that an occurrence is impossible simply because we've never experienced it or observed it is actually a complete weak argument. See, before we can decide on a thing having happened or not happened, we must discover whether a thing is possible. And if possible, how probable? That's the question. And so by Hume's own set of rules, one can't dismiss miracles, since it's impossible to actually investigate every potential miracle. In fact, Craig Keener, he just wrote a few years ago, wrote 2 volumes on miracles. And he points out the idea that there's probably 200 million claims of miracles in the modern world on all 7 continents. And so he says, in fact, out of the millions of claims of miracle events throughout history, it would only take one of those events being true to overthrow the entire naturalistic worldview. Think about that. So many people I meet have stories that demand some kind of explanation that can't simply be explained by natural means. And this is not a rare occurrence. It's something I encounter regularly, perhaps because I'm a pastor and I'm kind of in that world. I've seen people healed of diseases that everyone thought were incurable. I've had times when I'm praying and I have knowledge of things about people that I don't know naturally. This is life. It happens to us over and over and over again. And while these are not everyday occurrences, they happen often enough to make me sit up and take notice that maybe there is something behind the veil. So here's the thing. The new picture of the universe unfolding before scientists every single day makes miracles actually more probable than ever. They're telling us that quantum mechanics is just blowing the roof off all these theories of a closed system of nature. Dr. John Ehrman, who's this philosopher of physics at the University of Pittsburgh, he says this: if we try to define a miracle as an event that is incompatible with laws of nature, then it seems that water changing into wine, a dead man coming back to life, etc., are not miracles because they're not incompatible with quantum mechanics. Okay, to put it simply, here's the point. The universe is actually far more complicated than we previously thought it was. And the so-called laws of nature are being rewritten all the time. So Plantinga concludes that in the new picture, he says, special divine action, including miracles, is by no means incompatible with quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics doesn't determine a specific outcome for a given set of initial conditions, but instead merely assigns probabilities to the possible outcomes. There is no question that special divine action is consistent with science, and even the most stunning miracles are not clearly inconsistent with the laws now promulgated by science. That's the greatest living philosopher on the planet saying that. So let's talk about the trouble with probability. One of the mistakes that skeptics make is equating evidence with probability, which is a failed experiment in logic. And what I mean is, it's like arguing a lottery winner is lying because the chances of winning the lottery are so minuscule. You know what the chances of winning the lottery are? 76 million to 1. Does that mean no one wins it? Okay, so do you know what the odds of being dealt the perfect hand in bridge are? 1.6 trillion to 1. And so we'd go, oh, then it's never happened. And yet we know it has. Many, many people have actually reported that it has. See, if it's true that we cannot believe in one-time events that are unwitnessed and mathematically improbable, then by the same logic, the naturalists can't even believe in the Big Bang, or the idea that organic life originated through unguided evolution because we weren't around to see it and it's statistically so improbable and it hasn't happened again. So in the end, the skeptic actually fails to fully consider the evidence of rare events, right? Instead, they focus on the evidence for regular events and suggest that that somehow makes all rare events unworthy of belief. And the argument that a miracle is impossible because it is improbable is just silly. I have a buddy. We golf together all the time. And we were golfing in Arizona one day, and I kind of shot my ball out into the bush a little bit, and I went over and I picked up this ball. And I'd been playing with this other guy, and he kind of joined our group, and he wasn't a Christian. And so I was telling him about Jesus, and we kind of made the turn after 9 holes, and we're like, you should give your life to Jesus. You should, and he's like, man, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in any of this stuff. And I put my ball into the bush, and I walked up to it, and I picked up this ball, and this guy was walking beside me. And for some reason, the ball I found randomly in a bush in an Arizona desert said the word "Sweet Baby Jesus" on it. And I walked up to this guy and I'm like, hey, look, I got a ball. I just found this in the desert. It says "Sweet Baby Jesus." I think it's a sign. And he's like, dude, that's crazy. So we start talking. He's like, well, that's kind of just luck and whatever. So we get up to this hole, par 3, and my buddy hits his ball here, and I get up and I hit it, and I totally shank it. And it goes way up into the rocks, like "Sweet Baby Jesus" is gone. But then it hits a rock and bounces into the middle of the fairway. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on? And the guy's like, I have never seen that in my life. Next hole, par 4. I get up on the tee, I drive the ball, I shank it way off. It actually hits a rock in the middle of the desert, comes back over water, and lands in the middle of the fairway again. And I looked at the guy, I'm like, "Sweet Baby Jesus." He's like, "I've never seen 2 of those shots back to back in my life. This is crazy." I'm like, dude, this is "Sweet Baby Jesus, bro." And then my buddy gets up the next hole, puts one in the water on a par 3, and I throw him the "Sweet Baby Jesus" ball. Now, my buddy's not a great golfer, and so I say, if this ball goes in the hole, will you become a Christian? And the guy's like, I will actually become a Christian because this guy's so bad at golf, there's no way this ball goes in the hole. So my buddy hits "Sweet Baby Jesus" up over this pond. It lands in the green 8 feet from the hole and starts to roll toward the hole. 6 feet, 5 feet, 4 feet, 3 feet, 2 feet, and lips out of the hole and stops a foot from the hole. At this point, the guy we're playing with is on the ground, and he's ready. Honestly, he's like, I was going to give my life to Jesus. That was the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. The improbability of these things is so crazy. Now, that's not even the end of the story. Can I tell you something? I recounted that story one time in a sermon. And then I was sitting at a restaurant, and a girl walked up to me, and she said, you won't believe this. She's like, I met this guy in Vancouver. He lives in New York, and I was telling him about Jesus. We met at a bar, and we were hanging out. And he said, I live in New York. And she's like, oh, you should start going to church. And he's like, no, I'm not really into church. And she's like, okay, why don't I send you sermons from my pastor? So she goes, I go on the website, and I choose 2 random sermons. Like out of 10 years of sermons, I just choose 2 URLs and copy them and send them in a text to this guy. I don't hear from him for 2 weeks. And all of a sudden, he's like, I need to talk. She calls him up. He says, I'm sitting in my house shaking right now. He's like, you got to understand something. I'm not a golfer. 6 months ago, I flew with my buddies from New York City to Phoenix, and we were playing golf at a golf course, and there was a guy that was assigned to us, and his name was Ethan. And we started talking, and he told me the story about a guy that he'd met. And I realized that your pastor on his sermon was talking about the same guy I was playing golf with 6 months before that. And he's like, there has to be a God. He's trying to get in touch with me. He's trying to send me a message. See, all of this is so improbable, but it's true. And I'm not saying any of this proves God. I'm saying simply that the skeptics are wrong to simply add up the evidence for all the regular events that we experience each day and suggest this somehow makes all rare events unworthy of belief. See, the issue is not whether an event is regular or rare, but whether we have good evidence for it. That's what matters. So when we're speaking about miracles, we're referencing events that are admittedly rare. We get that, but it doesn't make them impossible. The evidence for the regular is not always greater than the rare. You only have to think up the counterexamples to disprove a claim. If we want to disprove the claims of naturalism that Hume talked about, we only need to return to two counterexamples mentioned before, which are foundational for the entire naturalistic worldview: the origin of the universe and the origin of life. Both of those events are rare, unrepeatable, and non-testable. They don't have any witnesses at all. And so here's what Craig Keener says. He says, Hume's arguments are now shown to be simply a product of his time. Had he lived in our day, an argument based on the non-experience of miracles would have proved much more difficult and less persuasive. For these and many other reasons, scholars are no longer entitled to simply dismiss the possibility of supernatural causation outright without proving why they are doing so. See, here's the thing. Rarity is not the same as implausibility. It is the case that all medical attempts to revive the dead have failed so far. That's true. But listen, can you honestly say for certain that in the future, medical advances will not reach a point at which dead people can be restored to life? Will you be willing to say that? I don't think so. So here's what one writer has said. It is a practical truth, useful for everyday purposes, that people die and don't come back, but it is not a necessary truth. And if it might happen one day, there is at least the logical possibility that it could have happened before. See, all that's true, not necessarily because nature's laws are overthrown, but because we simply lack complete and full knowledge of what those laws even are.